Nova's forehead pressed against the cool airplane window in seat 8A, her eyes closed tight against the world, against the memories, against everything she'd left behind. On the ground 3 hours ago, when Flight 427 lifted off from Atlanta. But the captain's voice crackling through the intercom shattered her fragile peace with words that made her blood turn to ice. "This is Captain Reynolds, and I need to know immediately if there are any licensed pilots on board this aircraft, preferably with combat or military flight experience. This is an urgent request." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs. Passengers shifting nervously, craning necks, whispering theories, while Nova kept her eyes shut even tighter, her 26-year-old heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Because she knew God. She knew that she was exactly who they needed. But she'd sworn 6 months ago, when she turned in her wings, that she would never step into a cockpit again. Not after what happened to Marcus. Not after she'd frozen at 2,000 feet, while her wingman paid the price for her hesitation. She was just Nova Chen now, not Lieutenant Chen. Not Black Nova like her squadron used to call her for her ability to disappear into the night sky. Just a scared young woman trying to fly commercial back to Seattle to clean out the apartment she'd shared with her little brother before his military funeral, before everything fell apart, before she became this hollow version of herself who couldn't even look at the sky without feeling like she was drowning. A flight attendant's voice cut through her thoughts, calm but urgent, making announcements, asking again, and Nova felt the passenger beside her, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, gently touch her arm and whisper, "Dear, are you all right? You look pale." And Nova wanted to say she was fine, wanted to disappear into her seat, but instead, she heard herself ask in a voice barely above a whisper, "What's happening?" The woman squeezed her hand and said, "They're saying the captain needs help. Something about the co-pilot being ill. Maybe a heart attack. I don't know. But people are scared, honey. You can feel it." And Nova could feel it, the shift in the air. The collective held breath of 200 souls suspended at 35,000 feet, depending on one pilot and whatever fate had in store. She opened her eyes and stared at her reflection in the window, seeing not just herself, but Marcus too, the way she always did, his bright smile and terrible jokes, his absolute faith in her abilities, the way he'd followed her into the Air Force because she made it look easy, made flying look like breathing, and she'd promised their mama she'd watch out for him, keep him safe up there in the endless blue. But she'd failed. She'd hesitated during a routine training exercise, when her instruments malfunctioned and Marcus had broken formation to help her, and the mid-air collision happened so fast, so impossibly fast, and though he ejected and survived the crash, something in him had broken, and 3 months later when he took his own life, Nova knew it was the sky that killed him, and her failure that let it happen. The announcement came again, more urgent this time, and Nova felt something shift inside her chest. A whisper that sounded like Marcus telling her what he always said, "Black Nova, don't hide. She flies." And before she could talk herself out of it, before fear could root her to that seat forever, she pressed the call button with a trembling hand, and when the flight attendant rushed over, a young man with worried eyes and sweat on his brow, Nova heard herself say words she never thought she'd speak again. "I'm a licensed pilot, military trained, combat experience. What do you need?" The attendant's face transformed with relief so profound it almost looked like he might cry. And he said, "Oh, thank God. Thank you. Please come with me right now. The captain needs you immediately." And as Nova stood on shaking legs, unbuckling her seatbelt, the elderly woman grabbed her hand one more time and said, "I knew there was something special about you. I could feel it. Go save us, sweetheart." And Nova wanted to tell her she wasn't special. She was broken. She was the girl who got her brother killed. But there wasn't time because the attendant was already rushing her forward through the cabin, past rows of frightened faces, parents clutching children, business people gripping armrests, a young couple holding hands and praying, all of them looking at her like she was their salvation, when she couldn't even save herself. The cockpit door opened, and Nova's breath caught because it had been 6 months since she'd seen a flight deck. 6 months since she'd touched controls, and the familiar layout of instruments and switches hit her like a physical force, like coming home and finding it burned down. And there was Captain Reynolds, a silver-haired black man in his 50s with exhausted eyes and the weight of 200 lives in every line of his face. And slumped in the co-pilot's seat was a younger man, unconscious, breathing but clearly in medical distress. And the captain turned to Nova, and she saw the flicker of surprise when he registered her age. Her small frame, her red-rimmed eyes that probably screamed broken, but he didn't hesitate. He just said, "Can you fly this bird?" And Nova's mouth went dry, but she nodded, and he said, "I need you in that seat. I need you to be my co-pilot. We're dealing with a medical emergency and some system malfunctions, and I can't do this alone. I need your hands and your head. Can you give me that?" She wanted to tell him about Marcus, about her failure, about the nightmares and the panic attacks, and the way she couldn't even drive past the airbase without hyperventilating. But instead, she helped him move the unconscious co-pilot, gently, carefully, while a flight attendant came to take him back to the cabin where a doctor was waiting. And then Nova was sliding into that seat, the leather familiar against her back, her hands hovering over controls she'd sworn never to touch again. And the captain was saying, "I'm David Reynolds. Been flying for 32 years, and I can see you're scared. I can see you're fighting something, but I also know military training when I see it. And right now, I need you to put whatever demons you're carrying in the overhead compartment and help me get these people home." Something in his voice, firm but not unkind, commanding but not dismissive, reminded Nova of her first flight instructor, a woman who'd seen her potential before Nova even knew it existed. And she felt her training kicking in, muscle memory overriding fear. And she started scanning instruments, checking readings, her hands moving through pre-flight verification procedures she'd done 10,000 times. And she reported, altitude 35,000 feet, airspeed steady, fuel levels good, hydraulics showing some fluctuation, but within acceptable range. And Captain Reynolds actually smiled, a small thing but real, and said, "There she is. There's my co-pilot. What's your name, Lieutenant?" And Nova felt tears prick her eyes because he'd seen through her immediately, recognized the military bearing she thought she'd buried, and she said, "Nova, Chen, sir, served 3 years. Combat, transport, and tactical support, honorably discharged 6 months ago." Leaving out the part about the medical discharge for psychological trauma, the therapy she'd stopped going to, the pills she couldn't bring herself to take. "Well, Nova Chen," the captain said, adjusting their heading, "I've got a situation here. My co-pilot had what looks like a cardiac event about 20 minutes ago. We've diverted to Denver. We're 40 minutes out. But I'm also getting intermittent readings on our hydraulic systems, and I need you to help me monitor everything. Talk to air traffic control, and be my backup if things go sideways. Can you do that?" And Nova felt the old fear rising, the what-ifs and the memories of Marcus's plane spiraling. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't felt in 6 months, purpose. The bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she needed to be, that maybe the universe had put her in seat 8A for a reason. And she looked Captain Reynolds in the eye and said, "Yes, sir, I can do that." The next 30 minutes unfolded like a dance between past and present, between who Nova had been and who she'd become, her hands moving across instruments, while her mind fought against memories that rose like ghosts in the cockpit. Marcus's laugh, the sound of the collision, the terrible silence after the funeral where she couldn't speak, couldn't cry, couldn't do anything but feel the crushing weight of her failure. But Captain Reynolds kept her grounded, kept her present, asking her to verify readings, adjust systems, communicate with Denver approach control, treating her not like broken china, but like the skilled pilot she'd worked so hard to become. "You're doing good, Nova," he said during a moment of relative calm. "But I can feel you fighting yourself. I can see it in your shoulders, the way you're holding your breath, and I need you here with me, not wherever you keep going in your head." And Nova's voice cracked when she said, "I lost someone, sir. I lost my little brother. He was my wingman, and I failed him, and I swore I'd never fly again because I don't trust myself. I freeze, I hesitate, and people die when pilots hesitate." And the captain was quiet for a long moment, adjusting their descent path, before he said, "I lost my daughter 7 years ago. Car accident. She was 16, and brilliant, and going to be a doctor. And after she died I didn't fly for 8 months. Couldn't do it. Couldn't be responsible for lives when I couldn't save hers. But you know what I learned?" Nova shook her head, tears streaming down her face now, and he continued, "I learned that we don't honor the people we've lost by stopping, by hiding, by making ourselves small. We honor them by being exactly who they believed we were, by using our gifts, by showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because that's what love does. It keeps going. It keeps flying." The words hit Nova like a shockwave, like truth delivered at the speed of sound, and she thought about Marcus, and how he'd always believed in her, how he used to say she was born with wings, how even in his darkest moments after the accident he'd told her it wasn't her fault, that she needed to keep flying for both of them. And she'd been so buried in grief and guilt that she'd forgotten that his last wish wasn't for her to suffer, but for her to soar. The radio crackled and Denver approach control came through with updated landing instructions, and Nova responded with a steadiness that surprised her, her voice clear and professional, calling out altitude and airspeed, cross-checking the captain's work, and she realized that she wasn't freezing, wasn't hesitating. She was flying, really flying, not just operating controls, but connecting with the aircraft, feeling it respond, trusting herself, and being trusted in return. "We've got some weather moving in," Captain Reynolds said, pointing to the radar. "Nothing we can't handle, but it's going to be bumpy. And I need you to make an announcement to the cabin. I need you to tell them we're going to be fine. Can you do that?" And Nova felt panic flutter in her chest because talking to the passengers meant accepting responsibility, meant stepping fully into this role. But she picked up the intercom handset and took a breath and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Nova Chen speaking from the cockpit. I'm assisting Captain Reynolds today, and I want you to know that we're about 20 minutes from landing in Denver. You may experience some turbulence as we descend through a weather system, but we are in full control of this aircraft, and we're going to get you safely on the ground. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and know that you're in good hands." When she hung up, Captain Reynolds was looking at her with something like pride, and he said, "That's exactly what they needed to hear, and I think it's what you needed to say, to claim your place here, to trust yourself again." And Nova nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. They descended through choppy air, the plane shaking and groaning, and Nova's hands moved with precision, adjusting flaps and monitoring systems, calling out readings. Her training and instinct merging into something that felt almost like muscle memory, almost like coming back to life. And when they broke through the clouds and Denver's light spread out below them like a constellation, she felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of grief and shame beginning to untangle. The landing was textbook perfect, Captain Reynolds bringing them down with Nova supporting every moment, and when the wheels touched the runway and the cabin erupted in applause and relieved crying, Nova felt tears streaming down her own face, but these were different tears, not the bitter salt of grief, but something cleaner, something that tasted like release. The captain taxied to the gate, where emergency vehicles waited for the co-pilot, and when he finally set the parking brake and shut down the engines, he turned to Nova and extended his hand and said, "Thank you, Lieutenant Chen. You saved lives today, including mine. And I hope you know that whatever you've been carrying, whatever darkness has been chasing you, you just proved you're stronger than it. You just proved you can still fly." Nova shook his hand, her grip firm despite the trembling, and said, "Thank you for seeing me, for trusting me, for reminding me who I am." And he smiled and said, "I didn't remind you of anything. You reminded yourself. You made the choice to stand up, to walk through that fear, and that's the hardest part. The rest is just mechanics and muscle memory." As they prepared to leave the cockpit, the flight attendant appeared with tears in his eyes and said, "The passengers want to thank you. They're calling you a hero." But Nova shook her head and said, "Captain Reynolds is the hero. I was just supporting." But the captain cut her off and said, "We were a team. That's how flight works. That's how life works. Nobody does it alone." Walking back through the cabin was surreal. Passengers reaching out to touch her arm, thank her, bless her. The elderly woman from 8 Amperes, gripping her in a fierce hug and whispering, "I knew it. I knew you were an angel." And a little girl, maybe 7 years old, looking up at her with wide eyes and saying, "Are you really a pilot? I want to be a pilot too." And Nova knelt down, her heart cracking open in the best way, and said, "Then you will be, sweetheart. You can be anything you decide to be. And when it gets hardened, it will get hard you. Remember that the sky is big enough for all of us. And brave enough girls can do anything." The little girl beamed and Nova felt something shift fundamentally inside her. Felt Marcus's presence not as a weight of guilt but as a whisper of encouragement. Felt the possibility that maybe her story wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning again in a different way. In the Denver terminal, as paramedics took the co-pilot away and airline officials swarmed with questions and gratitude, Captain Reynolds pulled Nova aside and said, "I'm going to file a report about what happened today, about your skill and your courage. And I'm also going to give you something." And he handed her a business card for a regional airlines training program, a second chance initiative for pilots returning to aviation. "I know the director personally," he said, "and if you want to fly, again really fly, not just in emergencies, but as a life, as a calling, you call this number and you tell them David Reynolds sent you. And Nova, I hope you call, because the world needs pilots like you. People who understand fear but fly anyway. People who've been broken and know how to piece themselves back together." Nova clutched the card like a lifeline, like a lottery ticket, like a letter from Marcus himself, and she said, "I don't know if I'm ready." And the captain said, "Nobody's ever ready. We just become ready by doing the thing that scares us. And today you did that thing. You stepped into the fire and you didn't burn. You flew. And that's something worth remembering on the dark days." They exchanged contact information, and he hugged her like a father, like someone who understood loss and survival and the long road back to yourself. And then he was gone, swept away by airline officials. And Nova was standing alone in the terminal with a business card in her hand and a choice spreading out before her like a runway waiting for takeoff. She found a quiet corner near a window overlooking the tarmac, watching planes take off and land, their lights blinking against the darkening sky. And she pulled out her phone and did something she hadn't been able to do in months. She opened her photos and looked at pictures of Marcus. Really looked at them, not flinching away from the pain, but letting herself remember the joy, the laughter, the brother who'd believed in her so fiercely that he'd followed her into the clouds. There was one photo she'd avoided, taken the day they both got their wings. The two of them in uniform, arms around each other, grinning like they owned the sky, and she'd deleted it a dozen times, but could never go through with it. And now she was grateful, because looking at it didn't destroy her. It reminded her that she'd been happy once, that they'd been happy, that flying had been their shared dream before it became their shared nightmare. She whispered to the photo, to Marcus, to herself, "I'm sorry I forgot. I'm sorry I let fear win, but I'm going to try again. I'm going to fly for both of us, and I'm going to be scared, and I'm going to mess up, and there will be days I want to quit. But I'm going to keep choosing the sky, because that's what you'd want. That's what you'd do. And I love you enough to be brave." A text notification appeared on her screen, interrupting the moment. And it was from an unknown number. "This is Captain Reynolds. Just wanted to make sure you're okay, and to remind you that today wasn't an accident. You were in seat 8A for a reason. The universe put you exactly where you needed to be. Don't waste the gift." And Nova smiled through her tears and typed back, "Thank you, Captain. I won't forget." And she meant it. She felt it in her bones. She spent the night in a Denver hotel, the airline's arrangement for displaced passengers, and she couldn't sleep, her mind replaying every moment in the cockpit. The fear and the exhilaration, the feeling of her hands on the controls, the way Captain Reynolds had trusted her, the way she'd trusted herself. And somewhere around 3 in the morning she made a decision, the kind that feels less like a choice and more like a returning, like coming home to a self you'd abandoned. In the morning, she didn't book a flight to Seattle to clean out the apartment. Instead, she called her mother, the conversation she'd been avoiding for months. And when her mama's voice came through the line, tight with worry and hope, Nova said, "Mama, I flew yesterday. A real emergency. I helped land a plane. And I know I've been lost. And I know you've been scared for me. But I think I'm finding my way back. I think Marcus is helping me find my way back." And her mother cried, deep grateful sobs, and said, "Baby, I've been praying for this. I've been praying you'd remember that you were born to fly. That losing Marcus doesn't mean losing yourself. And I'm so proud of you. So incredibly proud." They talked for an hour, really talked, about grief and guilt and the long process of healing, about how survival isn't betrayal and joy isn't disrespect to the dead, about how Marcus would want her whole and happy and soaring. And by the time they hung up, Nova felt lighter, felt possible, felt like maybe the shadows weren't permanent after all. She called the number on Captain Reynolds's card, her heart pounding, and when a woman answered, and Nova explained who she was and what had happened, there was a pause, and then, "Captain Reynolds already called me this morning, told me to expect to hear from you, said you were something special, and we'd love to talk to you about our return to flight program. It's designed for pilots who've experienced trauma or time away from aviation, and we believe in second chances, in helping skilled aviators find their way back to the cockpit." Nova scheduled an interview for the following week, and when she hung up, she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months: excitement, genuine anticipation for the future, the sense that her story wasn't ending in grief, but transforming, evolving, becoming something new and necessary. She booked a flight back to Atlanta, back to where she'd started this journey, and as the plane lifted off from Denver, she wasn't sleeping in her seat, wasn't hiding from the world. She was awake, alert, watching the ground fall away and the sky open up, her reflection in the window showing not just her face, but the ghost of who she'd been and the promise of who she could become. And she whispered to Marcus, "To the clouds, to the endless blue, I'm coming back. I'm scared, but I'm coming back, and I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to make us both proud." 3 months later, Nova stood in a flight simulator, part of the Return to Flight program, her instructor watching as she navigated a series of emergency scenarios. And when she successfully brought a simulated aircraft down with multiple system failures, the instructor said, "You're a natural, Chen. I don't know what made you stop flying, but I'm glad you started again." And Nova thought about Marcus, about Captain Reynolds, about the little girl in the cabin who wanted to be a pilot, about all the moments that had led her back to this place. And she said, "I stopped because I forgot that flying isn't about being fearless. It's about being brave enough to be afraid and do it anyway. It's about trusting yourself and trusting the sky and knowing that sometimes the hardest part is just showing up." And the instructor nodded and said, "That's the truth right there. That's what separates the good pilots from the great ones." 6 months after Flight 427, Nova received her certification to return to active flying, a commercial rating with a regional carrier, and on her first official flight as a first officer, she sat in the right seat of a regional jet. Her captain, a experienced woman who reminded her of her first instructor, and as they went through pre-flight checks, Nova felt Marcus's presence, not as grief, but as companionship, not as loss, but as legacy. And when they pushed back from the gate, and she spoke her first official words as a working pilot, pre-flight complete, ready for taxi, she felt the pieces of herself that had shattered finally clicking back into place. Not perfectly, not without scars, but whole enough, strong enough, brave enough to fly. Years would pass, and Nova would log thousands of hours, would eventually upgrade to captain herself, would mentor young pilots, especially young women and people of color who needed to see someone who looked like them in command, would tell them about the day she was sleeping in seat 8A, when the universe called her back to herself, would teach them that setbacks aren't endings, and fear isn't failure, and the sky is always waiting for those brave enough to return to it. And she would carry Marcus with her on every flight, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Not as the reason she stopped, but as the reason she started again, and on the hardest days, when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy, or the memories threatened to overwhelm her, she would remember Captain Reynolds's words that we honor the people we've lost by being exactly who they believed we weren't. She would take a breath, square her shoulders, and do what she was born to do, fly, and in flying, finally, fully, beautifully live.